Each species is a masterpiece of evolution that humanity could not possibly duplicate, even if we somehow accomplish the creation of new organisms by genetic engineering. This quote is pretty much self-explanatory and ties this whole chapter, The Origin of Species, together. In 1928, a young German zoologist named Ernst Mayr set off for the wilds of Dutch New Guinea to collect plants and animals. His one-man expedition was a great success where he brought back many specimens new to science. When he totaled up the names that the natives of New Guinea's Arfak Mountains applied to local birds, he found that they recognized 136 different types. Western zoologists, using traditional methods of taxonomy, recognized 137 species. This concordance between two cultural groups convinced Mayr, and should also convince us that the breaks of nature are not arbitrary but an objective fact. In fact, the most striking fact about nature is that it is continuous. When you look at animals or plants, each individual almost always falls into one of many discrete groups. For example, when looking at a wild cat, we are immediately able to identify it as either a lion, a cougar, a snow leopard, and so on. Although there is variation among individuals within a cluster, the clusters nevertheless remain discrete in organism space. We see clusters in organisms that reproduce sexually. These discrete clusters are known as species. Their existence may seem as a problem for evolutionary theory, seeing as how evolution is a continuous process, so how can it produce groups of animals and plants that are discrete and continuous, separated by others by gaps in appearance and behavior? How these groups arise is the problem of speciation, also known as the origin of species. If we want to explain biodiversity, then we have to do more than explain how new traits arise and must also explain how new species arise. Speciation is very important because if speciation didn't occur, there would be no biodiversity at all, only a single long evolved descendant of that very first species. And this, of course, is not what is true today. Before we can understand the origin of species, we need to figure out exactly what they represent. One answer is based on how we recognize species. As a group of individuals that resemble one another, then they resemble members of other groups. This definition is known as the morphological species concept. The category tiger would be defined something like that group including all Asian cats whose adults are more than 5 feet long and have vertical black stripes on an orange body with white patches around the eyes and mouth. This is the way Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, first classified species in 1735. This definition has some problems. In sexually dimorphic species, males and females can look very different. Early museum researchers working on birds and insects often misclassified males and females of a single species as members of two different species. There is also the problem of variation within an interbreeding group. Humans, for example, could be classified into a few discrete groups based on eye color, those with blue eyes, brown eyes, and green eyes. Why don't we consider them different species? The North American song sparrow has been classified into 31 geographic races, sometimes called subspecies, based on small differences in plumage and song. Yet members of all these races can mate and produce fertile offspring. So at what point are differences between populations large enough to make us call them different species? Some groups that biologists recognize as different species look exactly alike or nearly alike. These are known as cryptic species and are found in most groups of organisms. For example, the malaria-carrying mosquito is one of a group of 7 species that look almost exactly alike, but differ in where they live and which hosts they bite. Why, if these cryptic forms look so similar, we think that they're actually different species? The answer is that they coexist in the same location and yet never exchange genes. The members of one species just doesn't hybridize with members of another. The groups then are reproductively isolated from one another. So when we think of why we feel that brown-eyed and blue-eyed humans are members of the same species, we know that it's because they can mate with each other and produce offspring that contain combinations of their genes, or you can say that they belong in the same gene pool. When you think about cryptic species and variation within humans, you conclude that species are distinct not because they look different, but because there are barriers between them that prevent interbreeding. Using the previous definition, Mayer defined a species as a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other groups. This definition is known as the biological species concept. Reproductively isolated means that members of different species have traits that prevent them from successfully interbreeding, while members of the same species can interbreed. These traits could be differences in appearance, behavior, or physiology. What keeps members of two related species from mating with each other? There are many different reproductive barriers. Females in Drosophila species have chemicals on their abdomens that males of other species find unattractive. Species can also be isolated by preferring different habitats so they don't encounter each other. Two species of the monkey flower Mimulus live in the same area of the Sierra Nevada, but rarely interbreed because one species is pollinated by bumblebees and the other by hummingbirds. Isolating barriers can also act after mating. If fetuses are formed, they might die before birth, or maybe if the hybrids do survive, they may be sterile like the mule. Species that produce sterile hybrids cannot exchange genes. According to the biological species concept, a species is then a reproductive community, a gene pool. This means that a species is also an evolutionary community. So if a good mutation pops up within a species, then the gene containing that mutation will spread throughout that specific species. The biological species is therefore the unit of evolution. It is the thing that evolves. This is why members of all species generally look and behave pretty much alike. They share genes and respond in the same way to evolutionary forces. Under this concept, if you can explain how reproductive barriers evolve, you've explained the origin of species. An explanation to how these barriers arise was built upon the observation of sister species being often separated in nature by these barriers. Mayer argued that these barriers were merely the byproducts of natural or sexual selection that caused geographically isolated populations to evolve in different directions. Let's suppose that an ancestral species of flowering plants was split into two by a mountain range. This species was dispersed over the mountains within the area of birds. Now imagine that one of the two populations lives in a place having a lot of hummingbirds but only a few bees. In that area, the flowers will evolve to attract hummingbirds as pollinators. Here, the flowers would become red, a color that the birds find attractive, and have deep tubes to accommodate hummingbirds' long bills and tongues. The second population on the other side of the mountain will have flowers that evolve to attract bees and may become pink, a color bees like, and evolve shallow nectar tubes because bees have short tongues. Eventually, the two populations would diverge in the form of their flowers, and each would be specialized for pollination by only a single type of animal, either hummingbirds or bees. Now imagine that the barrier disappeared and the newly diverged populations found themselves back in the same area containing both bees and hummingbirds. They would now be reproductively isolated. Each type of flower would be served by a different pollinator, so their genes would not mix via cross-pollination. They would have become two different species.
What role does divergent selection play in speciation? Divergent selection is responsible for driving different populations in different evolutionary directions. As a result of the divergence, even though the population belongs to the same species, each population will adapt to its new environment to the point where if each population met again after many years of being isolated, they would not recognize each other as the same species, therefore affecting sexual selection as well. The female will prefer certain traits in each population. Sterility and viability of hybrids. The diversion of populations will affect the offspring if the geographical barriers were to disappear. With the barriers gone, the species would each contain different genomes that have evolved through selection in order to make them adequate for their environment. Considering their different genomes, they would produce hybrids which in most cases are either sterile or die prematurely. As time has passed, it has become evident to specialists that species are evolutionary accidents. The separation of two populations does not just happen because it will increase their diversity. Species are a result of genetic barriers that are selected for when populations drift apart and evolved in different directions. Speciation did not arise for the purpose of filling empty niches in nature, as Darwin thought.
Geographic isolation of populations is seen as the most common speciation, which means that a diverged species once shared a common ancestor. Although it's not always through geographic separation. For example, when Darwin's The Origin, he claimed that new species like plants can arise in a confined space known as sympatric speciation. The problem arises when trying to split one gene pool in two while still in the same area leaves little variation, which will lead the two populations to become a single species. How is it determined when two related species living in one place are actually from that same place? Inhabited islands, which are isolated terrain or water too small to contain any geographic barriers. For example, the cichlid fish lives in two tiny lakes in Cameroon. These lakes are too small to permit populations to separate. Research doesn't really know how or why. Sympatric speciation isn't always evident. There are some species in certain small oceanic areas where sympatric speciation would be the most reasonable explanation, but is not. Speciation in action, most often seen in plants, there are two forms. The first being allopolyploid, a hybridized species of two different species in the same area. This requires the two species to have different number of chromosomes, which produces a sterile offspring, leading for the hybrid to double the chromosome to be able to pair up, and in this case producing a fertile hybrid which are unable to inbreed with the sterile, resulting in two different speciation. The second being the polyploid speciation, which is just the doubling of the chromosomes of a single species known as autopolyploidy, which produce fertile hybrids when mating with other autopolyploidy, but sterile hybrids when breeding with its original parental species. In order for either to occur, the formation and union of sperm and eggs with abnormally high number of chromosomes is needed. This is possible given that plants produce millions of eggs and pollen, evident in the fact that 1/4 of all flowering plants came about through polyploidy. Polyploidy is a rare animal, but is seen in asexual species, at times seen in fish, insects, worms, and reptiles. There is one sexual reproducing polyploid mammal, which is the red viscera rat from Argentina. It is known to have 112 chromosomes, which is the most observed in any mammal. Why is it rare? Perhaps because polyploidy disrupts the XY sex determination, or for its inability for animals to self-fertilize. Polyploidy differs from other types of speciation because it involves changes in chromosomes and not genes. It is also known to be much faster, as fast as 2 generations' time. For example, the Welsh groundsel in North Wales is a hybrid flowering plant observed in 1958, which is said to have arisen between 1910 and 1958. Of 4, real-time speciation involves a hybrid between a native species and an introduced species. Polyploid speciation occurs rapidly when parental species live in the same place. It has occurred many times without notice. This is known because species that lived long before our time have artificially been reproduced and are identical to those found in nature.